The 1968 presidential election had three major candidates. Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey, who was the current vice president under Lyndon Johnson. Republican candidate Richard Nixon, who had been former vice president under Dwight Eisenhower. And American independent candidate George Wallace, former governor of Alabama. Between Humphrey and Nixon, the popular vote was extremely close. Humphrey achieved 42.7% of the popular vote, and Nixon won 43.4%. But in the Electoral College, Nixon achieved a solid victory with 301 electoral votes to Humphrey's 191. There was such a discrepancy between the popular vote and the electoral vote margins that the House passed the Bayh-Cellar Amendment Bill with bipartisan support, which would have eliminated the Electoral College if it had been ratified by the states, but it died in the Senate due to a filibuster. So how did Nixon achieve this victory? One of the most crucial ways was by securing Southern votes from what had been the solidly Democratic South. The Democratic Party had dominated Southern politics, both locally and nationally, since the 1870s. But in the 1960s, the party underwent a transformation. Democratic presidents and many Democrats in Congress in the 1950s and 1960s had been pushing for federal support for civil rights. Most significantly, Lyndon Johnson, who, with support from Northern Democrats in Congress, signed into law federal legislation known as the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. This alienated longtime Democrats in the South, who would become known as the Dixiecrats. This is where George Wallace comes into play. By explicitly appealing to white supremacy, famously declaring that he wanted to see segregation remain in place forever, he secured the votes of many of the Dixiecrats and even won 5 states in the Deep South. Wallace was the last third-party candidate to win any electoral votes, as of the making of this video. Nixon wanted to secure the same Southern votes that Wallace did, but realized that Wallace's openly racist rhetoric would not be as appealing nationwide. So Nixon and his allies developed a strategy to win the South that would realign the nation's political parties and alter voting patterns in ways that are still seen today. As the Democrats at the federal level moved toward supporting civil rights, Nixon and many other Republicans were willing to oppose civil rights to secure Southern white votes. Nixon and his strategists knew that securing the votes of black Southerners who had been denied their right to vote for many decades, as Republicans had done a century ago during Reconstruction, would not be as advantageous as securing the votes of white Southerners who had once been Democrats. This also caused a major change in voting patterns that is largely still seen today. Conservative Southern white voters generally shifted towards the Republican Party after 1968, while black voters generally shifted toward the Democratic Party. It's important to note that Nixon was careful not to condemn civil rights publicly. In fact, he actually supported several key pieces of civil rights legislation when he becomes president. But he appealed to Dixiecrats behind the scenes, promising Southern politicians that he would either hinder or somehow slow down desegregation efforts and federal enforcement of civil rights laws. Publicly, Nixon would continue to support these laws while saying that he supported, quote, states' rights. Southern Dixiecrats understood what this meant, though. This Southern strategy secured him several states in the election, including Tennessee, Florida, and both Carolinas, breaking the long-time Democratic hold on the South. But Nixon did not only win the South. He won many states across the country by appealing to what he called the silent majority, Americans who were not out protesting in the streets or holding rallies. He believed that most people opposed the radical changes taking place in the 1960s and were worried about the violence portrayed on the news. Thus, he made promises to restore law and order in America, though he was intentionally not very clear on what exactly that meant. Nixon recognized that by 1968, the vast majority of Americans wanted out of the Vietnam War, but he also knew there were many who wanted to see an American victory against communism in Southeast Asia. So he told Americans that he had a secret plan that would achieve peace with honor. This plan was unveiled the following November in 1969 and became known as Vietnamization. This was a plan to gradually turn the conflict over to the South Vietnamese supporting them with weapons and supplies, and decreasing U.S. involvement over time. So in summary, Nixon won the election in 1968 due to a combination of Hubert Humphrey's bad image and association with the war, and Nixon's effective appeal to Southern voters and the silent majority. It is also worth noting here that in the summer of 1968, Nixon convinced the South Vietnamese to withdraw from the Paris peace talks, telling them that he could secure them a better deal once he was president. These peace talks could have ended the war years earlier and saved tens of thousands of lives. But Nixon intentionally blocked these peace efforts so that his existing campaign strategies would not be ruined and he could win the election. If that's not bad enough, LBJ actually knew about this and even informed Hubert Humphrey. But they both decided not to reveal it to the American people because the information was obtained by illegally bugging phones, and revealing that could have incriminated them. They also wrongly assumed that Humphrey was going to win anyway and did not want to disrupt the current path they saw to victory. Although this information would not be revealed to the public for many decades, it demonstrates some of the things going on behind the scenes and the length that candidates may go to in order to win an election.